A new study of the coronial system has identified serious failings that constrain the ability of coroners to prevent further deaths. The University of Otago study was funded by the Law Commission and looked at more than 600 coronial inquiries that took place between 2007 and 2012. Its key finding was that the preventative and patient safety potential of coroners' recommendations is not being maximised due to serious systemic issues and under-resourcing. It identifies poor information sharing systems, a lack of training for coroners to make health and safety assessments, a shortage of available outside expertise and insufficient targeting of important coronial recommendations. Some went to no one in particular. The report's author, Jennifer Moore, the acting director of the Otago University Legal Issues Centre, is our guest in the Dunedin studio. Jennifer, good morning.
Good morning.
You investigated more than 600 coronial inquiries and identified some serious failings. What was of most concern?
Yes, before I answer that question, I'd just like to point out we were funded by the New Zealand Law Foundation, not the Law Commission.
I beg your pardon.
That's all right. Just thought I should point that out. So, coroners undertake important and difficult work, and there have definitely been improvements since the 2006 Act was introduced. But you're quite right, there are concerns. The main concern is the under-resourcing of the coronial service, and that means that coroners don't have easy access to the information that they require, nor do they get all the training that they need to really improve the quality of their recommendations. And we believe that this is a problem for New Zealanders because the community deserves a high-performing coronial system.
It's also, isn't it, the idea that you're wanting to prevent future deaths if something can be learned, if lessons can be learned. What were the sorts of recommendations that coroners were making?
Yes, absolutely. So the purpose of the Act is to try and prevent deaths, and one way that coroners can do that is to make recommendations. And we found in our 5-year study period that there were 1,644 recommendations, and the recommendations were on a range of different types of death, on drownings, sudden infant deaths, transport accidents, so a whole range of things. And it really depended on the type of death as to what the coroner would recommend, but there were definitely themes that came through. Transport accidents were commented on a lot, as were self-inflicted deaths or suicides, and you've probably heard the Chief Coroner speak about that in the media.
What were your findings about the failings then? Was it the case that many of the recommendations were not implemented? Was it more about information sharing not happening as it should? What were the issues?
The answer to that is both. So again, there was lack of resources. In particular, the coroners don't get adequate support. They only have 2 researchers for all the coroners around the country, which is woefully inadequate. And we think that really we should be looking to the Victoria, Australia model. And the people who I interviewed mentioned that over and over again, that we should look to that model, because over there they have a unit called the Coroners Prevention Unit, which contains many researchers, also clinicians, and they help the coroners to formulate really high quality prevention focused recommendations. And the coroners I interviewed in New Zealand said, look, we really take our prevention role seriously, but we just don't feel that we have the right training and resources to do that well.
Were many of the recommendations ever implemented, and if so, how?
Yes, they were. Overall, we found recommendations were seriously considered, and many of them were implemented.
Anything like 1,600, however?
No, definitely not all of them were implemented, and there were often good and valid reasons why they were not implemented. For example, organisations said to us, look, the recommendations weren't evidence-based, they weren't practical, it would have been too costly. Also, there was too much of a delay between the death and the recommendations being released, and we had actually already made our own changes to try and stop the loss of life in the future. So the coroner in that situation just endorsed what we had already done. And also some organisations pointed out that they received recommendations that shouldn't have gone to them, and therefore they couldn't actually implement them. And in that case, they sometimes pass them on to other organisations.
So what was the number or the percentage that were put into effect, whether it was by a change, regulation or something else? What sort of percentage were seen to have been given some kind of effect?
Well, it depends what you mean by effect or implemented. We divided that category up into recommendations that were implemented exactly as the coroner proposed, or recommendations that were partially implemented, recommendations that were considered but not implemented, and recommendations that were completely rejected. So if we look at the recommendations that were absolutely adopted in the way that the coroners said, that was a much smaller percentage. There was less than half. However, as I said, there were some recommendations which were partially implemented, or the organisation had already made a change along the lines that the coroner eventually suggested.
The other matter raised with you was a lack of resources, and I think, was there only 2 researchers, say, for all 17 of the country's coroners?
Yes, that's correct. So we mentioned that before, only 2 researchers for all 17 coroners, which, as I mentioned before, is really inadequate. The coroners, to really do their job properly, they need researchers who can do things like gather all the previous findings for them. Let's take an example, say jet skiing deaths. If a coroner is looking at that particular kind of death, he or she could ask the researchers to go and find out what the last 20 years worth of jet skiing deaths look like, what other coroners have recommended, what the scientific evidence says, how the evidence has changed, whether there is in fact any evidence around that, and use that information to write a recommendation that is prevention focused.
And this would be more aligned with the Australian example that you're saying is the gold standard, the Victoria example.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, that language was used by the people I interviewed. They either said it's the gold standard model or the Rolls-Royce model. And indeed, the researchers in Australia, they look at the evidence base, they work with the stakeholders, and they collect the data and then help the coroners to formulate their recommendations.
And they're quite diverse experts who deal with them as well, people like epidemiologists and clinicians.
Yes, absolutely. And indeed, in Victoria, not only do they have the coronial prevention unit, they have the coronial liaison service, which includes clinicians, epidemiologists, a range of experts who assist the coroners with healthcare-related deaths in particular, but also the other kinds of deaths.
Speaking of things falling on deaf ears, what do you think will happen to the Law Foundation funded study? Where's it going to go, and what influence do you hope it'll have?
Well, we hope that the Ministry of Justice might pick up our findings. That's our great wish and hope. And also, we've been working closely with the coroners and the chief coroner, who have been fantastic and who have already said that they've taken on board some of our findings. I can give you an example of that. We found that there were 72 recommendations in our data set that were not directed to any particular organisation, and the chief coroner has said in the media that they've taken that on board and that they are working to make sure that they always identify a particular person or organisation in their recommendation. So we're really pleased with that result.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer Moore, Acting Director of the Otago University Legal Issues Centre, on that report, that study they've done at the Otago University, funded by the Law Foundation, looking into coronial inquiries, more than 600 of them. And a key finding was that the ability to prevent future deaths was being undermined by a system that was just not really responding to many of the coroner's recommendations, and also questioning whether the coroners had all the resources they needed.